Welcome to the Federalist Society's event, Oh, How Inflated. My name is Richard Harris, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve rule of law principles and protect individual freedom, that separation of the government and its powers is essential to our Constitution, and that it is a province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what we want it to be. Our members hold diverse and often conflicting views on a broad range of issues. We exist solely to promote the exchange of ideas, not to promote particular policies, appointments, or politicians. Today, we welcome Yaron Brook, chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, author and advocate for objectivism, to speak on government spending and inflation. Without any further ado, it is my honor to welcome to the Michigan State University College of Law, Yaron Brook.
Thank you. You know, instead of seeing one person.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
As much as I love Jim.
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know there's a lot of competition for your time in law school, so I appreciate you being here today. You know, for the first time, really in 30, 40 years, we are talking again about inflation. So the numbers are out. It looks like the inflation in the US right now, and that means some measure of a basket of goods. And I'm going to pretend I'm drinking water if you don't mind, because this is ridiculous. So by some measure of a basket of goods, that basket of goods seems to be increasing in price about 5.5% year over year right now. So we're seeing for the first time significant price inflation in the United States. We haven't really seen this since the 1980s. The last time we had double-digit inflation was in the 1970s. Most of you, I think, were born. But I actually lived at the time, just to give you a sense, I lived at the time in Israel. I'm originally from Israel. And in Israel, in the early 1980s, inflation was over 1,000%. So we had hyperinflation. They literally took 5 zeros off the currency. So they switched currencies twice. Once they took 2 zeros off, the second time 3 zeros off, in order to cope with the fact that, so we didn't get to the point where like Zimbabwe was issued $1 trillion notes, right? Because the currency became basically worthless. You know, a lot of the inflation in the 1970s was very traumatic in the United States. It brought about, obviously, dramatic political change with the election of Ronald Reagan. I don't think he would have been elected if not for the kind of inflation that was there. People looking for an alternative and looking for something else other than the status quo. Inflation also, in spite of what economists promised us, inflation was also linked at the time with stagnation. So we got stagflation. For decades, people believed, many economists believed that stagflation was impossible, that inflation was a phenomenon of economic growth, and you couldn't have economic contraction and inflation at the same time. So we learned a lot, I think, the world, economists learned a lot from the inflation in the 1970s, and there's a certain sense in which politicians, because of the political consequences, politicians swore that we would never have inflation again, that they would do whatever they could, whatever was in their power, not to have inflation again. The Federal Reserve, which, as I'll say in a few minutes, is ultimately responsible for whether we have inflation or not. The Federal Reserve ultimately ended inflation in the United States in 81, 82, and they did it by jacking up interest rates really, really high. That is, by doing that, constraining the demand for money and constraining kind of the velocity of money and shrinking the amount of money in the economy very, very quickly. Interest rates went, you know, mortgages were 20+%. Imagine, right now they're 20%. As a consequence of that, the US economy tumbled into a deep recession. It recovered fairly quickly. But again, the pain of getting out of inflation was something that people remember, and people again swore not to experience again. So for decades now, we have had generally a policy at the Federal Reserve of doing what they think they can, what they think is best, in order to not have price inflation in the United States, and politicians have urged and continue to urge the Federal Reserve to maintain that policy. And this is to a large extent, it was true, I'd say, until maybe about, probably until about 10 years ago. Some of the attitude has been changing over the last decade. And much of that change is a consequence of the fact that government has decided that that they are going to spend with very little limits, that they don't want to tax people to cover the spending, and that they want to borrow money nonstop. And economists kept telling them, if you keep doing this, you keep spending without any control, raising debt, issuing bonds, the consequence of this is going to be higher interest rates and ultimately inflation. But we didn't get higher interest rates. Indeed, interest rates dropped. Post financial crisis, interest rates kept going down. So interest rates were lower and lower, and yet government was spending more and more, borrowing more and more. And a consensus started to evolve that, and it was formalized in a new economic theory called modern monetary theory, that basically suggests you can spend with no limits. You can borrow with no limits. There will be no inflation. You can spend it as much as you want. Don't worry, be happy, keep at it. Some of us continue to warn that this might cause some problems, maybe other problems other than inflation, but ultimately it'll probably be reflected in inflation. But it was ignored. Under George W. Bush, government spending tripled. Some of that because of war and 9/11, but much of it because of domestic spending and just expansion of domestic programs left and right. Under Obama, in the first 2 years, spending increased dramatically. It was mitigated a little bit in his last 6 years because he had to deal with the Republican Congress and Senate. Yeah.
People in the chat are requesting you just move a few feet over so they can see you.
So here.
Yeah, you
All
can
right.
just stand more in the middle. There you
All
go.
right.
Sorry. they
Really?
didn't-
Yeah.
Oh, I see myself. Okay,
Yeah.
we can do that. I can stay in. You're good. You're good.
Okay.
So the problem is most of you sat on that
I
side, so I
know.
gravitated towards where you are. So under Obama, spending was somewhat less expansive because the Republicans in Congress, Republican Party is generally a very good opposition party. When there's a Democrat in the White House, they tend to have constraints. As soon as they get power, they tend to spend money like there's no tomorrow. But when the Democrats in the White House, they tend to have a lot of influence on trying to restrain it. It worked very well with Bill Clinton in his last 6 years, and it worked very well with, less well, but almost as well with Obama in the last 6 years. In spite of how much Republicans tend to vilify Obama, over those 6 years, very little was done in terms of expansion of government, expansion of programs. After you go to Obamacare, Obama's agenda couldn't pass the House and Senate, right? And even spending was constrained. And then, of course, we got Trump, and Trump expanded government, went back to spending like there's no tomorrow, because that's what Republicans do when they get the White House. Even when they have the Senate and the House, they just spend like crazy. It was true of Reagan, it was true of Bush, it was true of Trump. And the one thing Republicans do is they cut taxes. So you get cutting taxes and massive spending. And even if tax revenue go up when you cut taxes, which indeed does happen, certainly happened in Reagan's era, and to some extent happened under Trump with corporate taxes. We're now seeing corporate taxes at record level because of the corporate tax cut. More money came into the United States rather than going overseas to tax havens. Plus, corporations are very profitable these days. They're paying a lot of taxes. Spending has been, out of control for much of this period. Now, what happened over the last 2 years with COVID is the spending just went, became dramatically increased. And again, under Trump and then under Biden, the only bill really he's passed, the only major bill he's passed was another almost $2 trillion, supported completely by Trump, or that is the components of it, the things that Trump supported. and would have passed himself if he were president. So this, again, Democrats and Republicans agreed, even though Republicans voted against it. Technically, they agreed with all the provisions in it and would have passed it if it was a Republican president. So we got this massive amount of spending, and usually what happens with spending is it goes to a wide variety. The scope is wide within the economy. It has a variety of different effects. COVID spending always focused basically on one thing: on getting money into your hands, right? On getting money into people's bank accounts, and into small businesses. So the PPP program that they initiated was very successful in bailing out the banks, because a lot of small businesses got checks basically from their banks that the government paid the banks for. And basically, almost everything that happened during COVID was a bailout of the banking system. We all got money as individuals, what did we do with it? We put it in our bank. And small businesses got money technically from the bank, but then the government paid the banks for giving the small business the money. So the bank took no risk, got a fee for issuing the loans, and then got it all paid off by the government. But what happened was you got a ballooning of deposits. So many people had a lot of money. I mean, relatively speaking, a lot of money in the bank account relative to and at the same time, they weren't allowed to go to work, right? Unless you were defined by some politicians as, quote, essential services, you weren't allowed to work. So, and this is not just true in the United States, this is true globally. So what happened as a consequence of that to the supply of goods? The supply of goods suddenly shrank and got constrained because fewer people were working. But people forget that when you tell people to lock down and not go to work, there's a cost. And what's the cost? They're not working. They're not producing. Most people who go to work actually produce something. They create a value. That value is gone. Now, it's obvious in restaurants and things like that, service as well. There was no demand for that. But what about all the manufacturing that happens? And again, not just here, all over the world. These jobs, many of these jobs slowed down because people stayed home. Some of them got sick. Somewhere between 4 to 5 million people in the world have died. Those people were working people. Some of them, a lot of them were kind of retired. So you have these constraints placed on supply. And at the same time, people got all this money in the bank provided by the government. And as soon as we slowly came out of COVID, I don't know that we are, you're still in masks. At least the law schools pretending we're not out of COVID. So as soon as you came out, right, people wanted to spend stuff. They wanted to do things. They wanted to spend that money. So they took that money and started spending it. But there's not a lot of goods being produced. And as companies are trying to ramp up production, there are all kinds of problems now. It turns out that the container ships are not in the right places because for a year and a half, everything's kind of not worked exactly right. So supply and demand got all messed up. The pricing signals that you typically get were distorted by COVID, particularly by the fact that we're not allowed to gouge. The laws, there's the laws against gouging. Now that makes no sense as an economist. That makes no sense. Because what are you doing when you don't allow people to gouge? You're distorting the supply and demand. You're distorting the price signal. So imagine if early on in COVID, when all of us rushed to buy toilet paper in the supermarkets and the grocery stores had been allowed to jack up prices. If they'd been allowed to jack up prices, who would have bought the toilet paper? Those who valued it the most. And some people would have just bought enough just for the week, not for the year and a half, right? Because it was expensive. And as prices jacked up, what signal will that have sent to the manufacturers? Ooh, there's a lot of money to be made in making more toilet paper. So they would have gone into massive production, assuming they could get the employees, and that making toilet paper was considered an essential service, right? But they would jack up production and fill the stores with more toilet paper. As more supply came online, what would happen to the price? It would start coming down. But there would never be a situation where the shelves were empty. The reason the shelves were empty was because we disconnected supply from demand. We didn't allow the prices to adjust to the increase in demand. That's what happens when you have central planning tinkering with the price mechanism. Whenever you have price controls, whenever you have a government attempting to determine what demand, supply, prices should be, you get distortions and perversions. You get misallocations. And that's exactly what happened during COVID. And right now we're suffering exactly from that, because you've got a massive mismatch again between supply and demand. Demand is artificial because demand is a product of government paying us, putting money in our bank accounts, and supply can't keep up. And the supply chains are all distorted because nobody was prepared for this. Because they didn't get the price signals to tell them that this is something that was going to happen. Of course, lockdowns are not a market phenomena, they're government phenomena. Although, if the government hadn't locked us down, some people would have chosen not to go to work. Some employers would have told people not to come to work. So there would be some level of decline in supply. But that decline would have been much more market-driven and would have been reflected much more quickly in prices, and would be much easier to recover from than the government arbitrarily decided who is an essential employee, who's not, who should stay home, who cannot, what prices can adjust, what prices cannot, and then also sending us checks into our bank accounts. So what we're seeing today is a shortage of supply, an increase in demand. What do we know when we have a lot of demand and a limited supply? What happens to price? So we have a little bit of goods, lots of people want them. Prices go up. So what we're seeing is prices going up. This is the 5.5% price inflation that we're seeing, and in some products it's much higher than that. And this is, so this is a product of a lot of money chasing fewer goods. Now, the Biden administration is claiming it's, quote, transitory. Why transitory? Because they're arguing that at some point production will catch up. And when it catches up, you know, supply will match demand again, and everything will go back, in a sense, to normal. But I don't think anybody right now thinks that transitory is a few weeks or transitory is a few months. Transitory right now, given the nature of the misallocations here and the mismatch, is probably much more long-term. And of course, you've got a much bigger problem. And that is the problem that we've been building up to over the last few decades. And that is massive government spending, massive government debt, and a need to constantly fund this debt. We've also got, what, a 3.5 trillion, I guess they've cut it down now to $1.5 trillion proposal for a new, what do they call it, social infrastructure plan, and another trillion or so dollars for a physical infrastructure plan. So you got another $2.5 trillion of spending coming down the pipe, which is more demand with limited supply, which is should drive inflation even higher over the next few years. Think about supply. There's one more dimension to the limited supply, and that is a lack of workers. One of the interesting phenomena that we're seeing right now, which I don't remember ever seeing before, is the degree to which there are jobs available and not enough workers to fill them. And you know, they're calling this period right now the Great Resignation, because we're seeing more people quit, more people leave their jobs than we've ever seen, at least since we're measuring it. We've only been measuring this statistic since 2000. So over the last 21 years, this is, August was the worst month ever in terms of people resigning. Now, I don't know, that's bad. If they're resigning and going to other jobs, that creates more competition in it. But as a consequence, what happens again when you get a shortage of workers? Workers are willing to quit and change jobs. What happens to wages? They're going up, and wages never come down. So once wages go up, they'll stay up, and that means the cost of doing business for businesses is higher, which means they have to compensate for that by charging you more for prices. So prices are never coming down again. primarily because of this pressure for wages. Now, why do we have a shortage of workers? Well, two things. One is, for a long time, we paid people not to work. Indeed, unemployment insurance was so generous that for a certain percentage of the population, it was more generous than the job they could have done. But think about it, even if it was less generous than the work they could have done, they got it for free. So a lot of people took a pay cut, but stayed home and watched Netflix, Squid Games, and didn't have to go to work, right? And now that the insurance is gone, the idea is, oh, they're gonna all rush back to work. Well, some of them are not, because some of them have this money sitting in the bank. They got the different forms of stimulus, they got the unemployment insurance, they've got a little bit of cushion in the bank. And they figure, well, we'll stretch it out a little bit, wages are going up. Why not wait to see how high the wages will go and then enter the job market, try to make it at the peak, not right now. And then delaying entering the job market. So you've got massive shortages in service industries, particularly in restaurants, supermarkets, a lot of manufacturing jobs, shortages. But what's interesting is you've also got massive shortages at the high end. Silicon Valley cannot hire enough engineers. There's just not enough programmers out there. They can't find them, they can't hire them. Amazon is so desperate that a starting salary for somebody who just did a boot camp in programming that knows nothing, is $150,000 a year. Starting salary. Because they're just desperate for people. So there's massive competition between the tech companies in terms of attracting people to them. So why is that? What's missing at the high end? Why can't we get enough people to come and work there? Well, that's a consequence of the fact that, and this goes back to the Trump administration, that's a consequence of the fact that we don't allow enough immigrants into this country. And primarily over the Trump years, we limited immigration, we limited H-1Bs, we've limited green cards, and during COVID, you weren't allowed to fly into the country. H-1B, there's a massive backlog of H-1Bs and green cards and work visas generally. And we don't have enough people to fill all the jobs that America needs in order to produce the stuff that we all need. It just doesn't exist. And labor mobility, people don't understand how beneficial labor mobility is for economics. The ability of people to move to where they can be more productive and therefore contribute more economically and earn for themselves more is a massive contributor to GDP growth. And the fact that we lived through a few decades where we had significant migration in the world contributed enormously to growth, to economic growth. Like some of that happens within countries, some of that happens outside countries. One of the problems with the U.S. economy today, and has been for the last 10 years or so, is that people don't move in the U.S. There's a lot less mobility across state lines in the U.S. than we've ever had in our history. Typically, if you couldn't find a job in Michigan, you got in your car and you went somewhere where you could find a job. That has stopped now. People are moving far less than they used to. A lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the government benefits are associated with the state, and every state has different benefits. And if you move to another state, you have to start the whole bureaucratic process again. But it also has to do with the fact that housing is very expensive in the US. Another reason why prices are going up is we don't build enough. We don't build enough housing. So they are that we are 10 million homes short in the United States. Right? If you look at household formation over the last 15 years, and you look at the number of houses built over the last 15 years, we're 10 million houses short. Now, why is that? Why would it be that we're not building enough to match the demand? Again, supply and demand issues. Why are we in a position where we're not building enough to match the demand? Yeah.
Disincentive to enter the market and build houses?
No, it's huge incentive because prices are going like this, particularly in a place like California, where you have a huge shortage, prices are going like this, so you have a huge incentive to go in.
Restricted zoning?
Yeah, restricted zoning, massive restrictions that apply to the ability to build homes, where you can build homes, massive environmental regulations, all kinds of regulations that restrict not in my backyard. In San Francisco, for example, like if I own a home in San Francisco, do I want them to build more houses? No, because my home price is going like this. I'm a huge beneficiary of the shortage, right? Now, I also have to live with lots of homeless people, which is partially caused by the fact that house prices are going up like this. But I don't want them building condo buildings in San Francisco. They might block my view. You laugh, but this is exactly the reason, right? So not in my backyard, NIMBIT is a reason why we have such high home prices, and that of course contributes to the whole story about price inflation. You have shortages of workers, you have shortages in housing, and then you have all this, what they're calling supply chain backlogs, which, you know, again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have, you know, in LA ports, there's a section of the port where they can only stack containers too high. Containers can be stacked 5, 6 high. They can only stack too high because there's some regulation where the neighbors have complained that it's blocking something, right? So there's a regulation that can only stack them too high. So they finally figured this out, and they put a lot of pressure to loosen the regulation. Now they're stacking them 5, 6 high. So they can't bring the stuff in. There are not enough truck drivers. We've got a massive shortage of truck drivers in the US. Opening salaries for a truck driver right now is $80,000 because they're trying to attract truck drivers, right? But so again, we got all these mismatches, and again, a lot of people left trucking during COVID. They weren't, some of them were not essential, and they left, and trying to get them back is very difficult. So all the distortions that we've seen have triggered this inflationary cycle. But fundamentally, inflation is when you have too much money chasing too few goods. When you print more money, then productivity increases the number of goods. That's when you get inflation. And if you know, that's the simple way in which what printing money means in the modern economy is a whole complicated, very complicated question. And why economists are so pathetic at predicting inflation is because very few understand what printing money actually means in a financialized world like we have today. But what we've seen over the last, certainly since the financial crisis and through COVID, is a massive amount of money printing and very little increases in productivity. And that mismatch has been around. It hasn't really been reflected in inflation until it needed kind of a trigger. And that trigger was COVID. That trigger was all the mismatches we're talking about now. And really the only way to suppress this inflation, the only way to stop is going to be to shrink the supply of money, which means higher interest rates, which means less government spending, which means things that politicians do not want to do, do not like doing, are not motivated to do. And politically, it's going to be really interesting. I think we're entering a really interesting political time. I think you saw that yesterday with the election, right? Republican governor winning in Virginia, which went to Biden by 8 points, and in Northern Virginia, where where it's considered a Democratic stronghold, they did very well. You see New Jersey of all places, too close to call. Nobody expected the Republicans to come even close. I can't remember what margin Biden won that, but I think it's like 15 points. She's seen a certain rejection, and I think most of that is the social agenda of the left. I think there's some rejection of the social agenda right now, particularly in Virginia. It was about schools and parents. But I think it's also a rejection of all the spending and a beginning of economic angst. What's going on here? How are we going to get out of this? And now the real question is going to be, can the Republicans respond? That is, do the Republicans have anybody who can respond to this from a pro-liberty, pro-economic freedom perspective? Shrinking government spending, shrinking government controls, letting the markets work. Because Trump ain't it. And everybody's convinced he's going to run in 2024 and be the nominee. But Trump can't handle this and doesn't believe in it and doesn't advocate for it. So can the Republicans find someone who is actually pro-markets pro-limited government, pro-shrinking spending, in order to, give me 2 minutes and then I'll take questions. In order to implement this. So politically, the next few years are going to be really interesting. I think Republicans will probably win the midterm elections in the House. They might even take the Senate back, which will give them again the position of an opposition party. So I like that fact because they'll control Biden. The real question is what happens in 2024 from that perspective. Let me just say this. You know, I come at all of this from the perspective of economic liberty. I am a 100% capitalist and really believe in no role for the government in the economy. I would like to see the economy and the government separate. You know, if I could rewrite the Constitution, I know I'm not supposed to say this in the law school, but if I could rewrite the Constitution, I would have a separation of state from economic provision in the Constitution, not just a separation of state from church, but a separation of state from economics. Because I think anytime that the state tries to dabble in economic policy, it screws things up. It doesn't help, and it messes up. I'll just finish by encouraging you guys to look into reading Ayn Rand, and some of you probably have. But if you haven't read Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, Capitalism, An Unknown Ideal, highly recommended to get the intellectual ammunition that I think we're all going to need as we go into an economic period of, I think, a lot of uncertainty, a political and economic period of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of angst and a lot of infighting within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, and maybe a complete realignment of American politics. We're going to need some significant intellectual firepower in order to understand it, in order to deal with it, and I recommend Ayn Rand as one source for that firepower. Thanks. So you had a question?
Well, I was just going to say, you said that the Republicans need to find somebody who has a reputation as a competent administrator, but also pro-liberty, free market economy. Isn't that Ron DeSantis that generally first being advanced as the flagship thing?
Yeah, so you know, I'm not an expert on politics, so and I'm not a fan of 99% of politicians, 99.9% politicians. I've just never been impressed by a politician. It could be that it's Ron DeSantis. It's hard to tell because Ron DeSantis seems. I fear that Ron DeSantis leans towards the populist side. He leans toward Trump, towards more of a Trumpian attitude towards a role of government and economic policy. I'm not, you know, we'll see how he runs and what his agenda is. Florida generally is the freest state in the nation from an economic perspective. Not only does it have zero taxes, but it has relatively low regulation. So there is such a thing as an economic freedom index, state by state economic freedom index, and I think Florida is #1. But it's not #1 because of DeSantis. It was #1 long before DeSantis. DeSantis inherited a relatively free state. Whether he actually believes in cutting government spending, whether he actually believes in getting out of the way, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical about his commitment to private enterprise and into private businesses, partially because of his, cruise ships are trying to get their business back. So the cruise ships are basically requiring people to have a vaccine if they want to go cruising. And DeSantis has basically passed a law that if you leave from Florida on a cruise ship, the cruise ship cannot demand that you have a vaccine. That to me is bizarre. And anti-free business, free markets, because businesses should be allowed to set their own terms of service. It's funny that conservatives who think the baker has a right to not bake the cake if they don't want to, says a cruise ship does not have a right to turn you away if you're not vaccinated. That's just a massive contradiction right there. But it plays to the social agenda and to the populism of where Republicans are right now, right? Anything anti-vax is okay with Republicans. And then he's problematic in free speech, but I don't know what his positions on economics. We'll see. I hope that's right. Yeah, the professor there.
My question was, if wages, you mentioned before, wages don't come down. So I wanted to ask in particular about truck driving wages. But now $80,000. I just think I'd enjoy that line of work. And it just seems like a lot easier than what I do now. Being on the open.
Well, it will be on open road,
Yeah.
playing the music,
Oh, yeah.
not having to report to anybody,
No students.
no. Get to where you're going and on time. I mean, I used to dream about being a truck driver. I thought that would be
But,
cool.
but in all seriousness, $80,000, is that, are we stuck there now? And is it, like, what forces might potentially bring some of these?
Well, obviously,
down?
a rush of people to the job, right, would start reducing, but what happens is people who are getting $80,000 are not gonna be fired, right, because that would be all kinds of labor law restrictions on that. And the fact is that the way the US economy works and has worked since the Great Depression is wages almost never go down, right? It's not like, well, we're in deflationary time, so I'm giving you a 2% cut. That just doesn't fly. It doesn't happen, unfortunately. I think it would be a good thing because the more flexible wages are, because I'd rather fire some people than lower everybody's wages. And I don't think that's economically optimal, but that's what happens. So we'll see how the market responds to it. But the fact that there were trucking shortages even before COVID. So it's a profession that's difficult to attract people to for whatever reason. It does seem romantic, but probably not in reality. And it does require a certain level of responsibility, quite a bit of training, I think. And there has been a labor shortage there for a while. It just is exacerbated now. But I do think wages are going up across the whole thing. I mean, we're seeing now the consequences of certain terms that the unions have received at the ports. Unions are not strong generally in the country. Union labor is at the lowest. Union participation is the lowest it's ever been in the U.S. But in places like ports, they have a lot of power, and they've cut deals in the past that are very attractive to labor, with very low, very high wages and very low, work hours, and very easy work hours. And now when there's a crunch, you can see the consequences. They're just not working enough hours to deal with the crunch, particularly in LA and Long Beach, where there was a strike about 15 years ago, and they got a lot of concessions over there. How that's going to play out? Are they going to allow new employees to be hired into the ports? At what wage rates and all of that? Or are owners of ports now going to say, wait a minute, we're overpaying you, given the amount of work you're doing? You're seeing a lot of strikes right now. Labor's using this to strike. So you got the Caterpillar strike. For the first time, auto union is striking, I think, for the first time in 30 years. Because it couldn't afford to strike in the automobile industry because the automobile industry wasn't making money for a long time. So I think it's all in flux, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it pans out. But it really depends on what are the fiscal outcome is. Are we going to pass $3 trillion of additional spending? If you add the two bills up, maybe it's $2.5 trillion. And then what does the Federal Reserve do? All of this is going to determine if the Federal Reserve takes this, starts spiking interest rates, you could see a recession where labor flips, where suddenly we're laying people off. But look, one of the real problems with raising interest rates is who would have to pay higher interest rates, right? All of us to some extent, but who is the biggest borrower in the economy in the world, really? U.S. government. So suddenly, and US government is very smart. Politicians are super off the chart smart. So what kind of debt do they borrow at? What kind of bonds does the US borrow at? Anybody know? Like if I want to, I have to fund this project, so I'm going to buy what kind of bonds am I going to sell? Yeah.
10-year treasury bond is about 3%.
Yeah, but what is the bulk of US debt? What's its duration? What's its it's not 10-year. What they funded very short term. So most US debt that's funded today is 3 to 6 to 1 year. They don't do a lot of 10-year, they certainly don't do 30-year. So here are these, I mean, all you have to take is one finance class and get this, right? If you're funding government deficits, you want to fund them with long-term debt. Because then as interest rates changes, your interest payments are static, they're constant. So if interest rates go up one day, you don't care that much because your debt is whatever interest rate you agreed to when you funded 30-year debt. And over the last 10 years, interest rates have been unbelievably low, even for 30-year bonds. So you'd think somebody in the government would say, we should stop funding it short term. It's like, you know how you do a mortgage and it's variable rate? Like variable rate mortgages are really, really good when interest rates are going down or when they're flat. But when are they really, 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 really bad? When interest rates are going up. So think about the government is funding all of its debt, $21 trillion, 100% of annual GDP, with short-term debt that is on a variable rate mortgage. When they have the opportunity to issue long-term debt, imagine if the federal government actually issued a perpetuity. You know what a perpetuity is? It's forever. They just pay interest forever. They never pay the principal. I think the market would buy it. But that you have to have people in politics who have an understanding of finance, or in the treasury who have an understanding of finance, and who have a long-term perspective on the world. What's the benefit of issuing debt as a short run? Very short-term debt. It's the lowest interest rates. So under my watch, my 4 years, we're going to pay very low interest so that the deficit doesn't grow too much. So instead of 3% over 30 years, they're doing 0.5% for 6 months and putting us all at risk that if interest rates go up. And now what is the Fed going to do? The Fed jacks up short-term interest rates. Suddenly the federal government's deficits are going to balloon because their interest payments are going to grow dramatically. So the number of quandaries that we have placed ourselves in, we're basically at a sort of a dead end. We're basically at a sort of a dead end here, where there are no good options for government because of the way government has behaved over the last 40 years. It's a cumulative effect of what they've done over the last 40 years. We have now got no good option. And the future for the US economy, it's not positive. It hasn't been, we haven't had a good economy since, since Clinton, really. Economic growth, Trump hailed the best economy ever. The economy is going at 2%. 2% is pathetic. And you think the difference between 2 to 3% is insignificant, it's 1%. How big is that? But if you compound that, it's huge. If we over the last 100 years had grown, the United States had grown 1% less of GDP per year over the last 100 years, we today would be poorer than Mexico. That's how important 1%. So when we give up 1% of economic growth because of what they're doing in Washington, that's your quality of life 10, 20, 50 years. That's your children and grandchildren's quality of life 100 years from now. The differences are unbelievable, and there's nothing more important. If you care about the world, there's nothing more important than economic growth. Think about this. If you grow the economy 2% a year for the next 40 years, then somebody making today $50,000, assuming his wages are growing at the same pace as GDP, they will make close to $100,000 in 40 years. Yeah, right. What's that? Yeah, about it's a little bit. Yeah, I don't have my calculator here, but it's something like that, right? But if the economy goes at 5% a year for the next 40 years, how much will somebody making $50,000 a year make in 40 years? In real term dollars, this is real money, not pretend money. 7 times as much, $350,000 a year. So suddenly, you don't have poor people. Take somebody making $20,000 a year today. In 40 years, at 5% growth, they're making $140,000 a year. $140,000 a year is not rich, it's not poor anymore. 20,000 is. So to get rid of poverty, all you need is economic growth, substantial economic growth. So when we limit our capacity to grow our economy, we're basically making sure everybody stays poor. And of course, if you make $100,000 a year today, you make $700,000. Now start thinking about what happens when being a millionaire or making $1 million a year is not a big deal. How rich our lives could be in that sense. And we're this close to it. And we're gonna screw it up because we're giving up those percentages of growth.
If wages, salaries would rise like that, wouldn't, price of goods, price of basically anything you want to purchase rise as well, right? Like you're still making $100,000. Yeah, you're sitting pretty in 2020 making $100,000, but down the line, everything seemingly would be more expensive to purchase homes, things like that. And wouldn't $140,000 just have to be the new poor?
No, because there'd be new poor because people would define them as the new poor because they'd be relatively poor, right? Because they'd be relatively other people. But no, because this is real growth. So this is adjusted for inflation. So I'm taking into account inflation. So assume you have 5% real growth, 5% nominal growth. Completely depends on what the inflation rate is, whether that helps or not. So this is real. This is above and beyond inflation. And this is what we used to grow at. This is not science fiction. This is not an impossibility. And in the 19th century, the US economy grew often at double-digit growth rates. So it is possible to grow. Now, some economists claim it isn't, but and the whole book's written about the fact of end of growth, right? I don't believe that. There's no reason to believe that. So it's all a question of the kind of policies we have and the kind of education people get, whether we can actually do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've actually studied a little bit kind of the recession period that occurred in the early 80s and stuff. And if I remember correctly, it took 3 years to get out of it, of monetary.
It was pretty quick. It was actually less than 3 years because Ronald Reagan got elected in '84 in a landslide because the economy was roaring back. So if you think about it starting in '81, so probably by '83, late '83, it was already over and the recession was over. So it was a quick but very sharp recession.
Okay, so I guess given the state of our economy now, the challenges we face compared to what we've done, how long, in your opinion, would it take to get out of inflation now?
Well, a lot of it depends on what the government does. So I think it'll take a long time because I think the government will do all the wrong things. Because that's what it's done over the last 40 years. It always does the wrong thing. So for example, during the financial crisis, you saw this. We learned all the wrong lessons from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. We did all the wrong things. And we basically created a decade in which we barely grew. We grew at 1-2% a year from 2008 to COVID, right? There's no indication that we've learned any lessons from that, right? So the best thing the government can do, put it this way, the best thing possible for the government to do is nothing. The best thing government can do is actually cut spending. Actually, get out of the way, reduce regulations and cut spending. But we've increased regulations so much, we've increased spending so much, we've made so many people in our economy dependent on the government and its spending that I don't see how we respond better without a major crisis that forces our hand. So I just don't see it. I think we're heading towards a period of stagnation. I think we've already been in stagnation. It's only going to get worse. I think the economy's not going to grow. Now we have inflation, so we might have stagflation. If we raise interest rates and drive the economy into recession, we might get a period of negative economic growth. I don't think that's unreasonable to assume. I think your generation is going to have a hard time. I don't think it's going to be simple unless we have a real political change. Now, economic shock can drive real political change, but whether it will in this case or not is yet to be determined. It's hard to tell.
I just wanted to clarify, when you were talking about increased economic growth, for making everybody wealthier, eliminating poverty, you were talking about in terms of absolute living standards, absolute buying power?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing about relative. You're always going to have inequality. inequality is part, feature of human nature. So I'm talking about absolute poverty. So even today, the poor in America on an absolute level are far richer than many middle-class people around the world. They have more stuff, they have more money, they work less. But in terms of relative poverty, and my argument is, imagine if they were 7 times richer, then there's no poverty anymore. Even if some of them fall behind and they're 5 times rich, there's no real poverty in the United States. So, but that is in an absolute sense. Sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
All right, so when it comes to people who are sitting in these seats right now, we're about to enter the economy and be able to, we'll have be salaried, have careers, have jobs, and be able to buy homes, really be participants in the economy, start businesses, maybe eventually buy businesses once you have a successful business. How is, it's giant, I don't know how many trillions of dollars of debt, inflation, and Federal Reserve policy, how's that going to affect us as players in the economy going forward? To me, I mean, it's a little pessimistic, but I just don't see us having the same economic opportunities that the generation before us did.
Yeah, I think to a large extent that's true. I mean, you're lawyers, so you'll do fine, right? The bigger government grows, the more jobs there are for lawyers. It's just a reality, every few years, government passes a new law that's Full Employment Act for lawyers and accountants. The more complexity we have in the world, the more we need you, the more government regulates, the more complexity you get in the world. That's a reality. So if you go into the right field of law, you have nothing to worry about, because as long as, if I ever became, economic czar of the United States, you'd be in trouble. Because a real market does not require as many lawyers as we have. You guys are dragged on economic growth. That's a reality. Or the things that you're implementing are dragging economic growth. There are way too many lawyers in the world, way too many accountants. So you guys are going to enter an economy where you're going to make a decent living, but the fact is the economy is going to grow a lot slower than it has in the past. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get stuff done. Some things will grow, will continue to remain expensive. Now, maybe not in Michigan, but in high desirable areas, real estate is going to be only going to get more expensive. So, if you're a lawyer in San Francisco, you better be charging $1,000 an hour, otherwise you can't afford anything. And I have a lawyer in San Francisco who charges $1,200 an hour. That's because that's they need to survive. And everything's going to be harder. The economy is going to grow less. There are going to be fewer opportunities. It is pessimistic. There's no positive spin on this. The fact is that your parents and grandparents have screwed up the world for you, and they have. People talk about the greatest generation or the boomer generation. They all screwed it up, right? Your great grandparents, parents. There's been no responsible government in the United States for 100 and something years. I can't think of a president I like. Last president I liked was Calvin Coolidge. That was in the 1920s. Right? I mean, Reagan was okay because he gave a great speech, but when it came to actually doing stuff, right? Didn't do that much. Look at spending. Look at deficit. How much he grew under Reagan. He cut taxes. Good, but every Republican can cut taxes. That's easy. Republicans are good at cutting taxes, but it's the hard work of eliminating programs, of shutting down. I mean, he came into office saying he was going to close three different government departments, and by the end of his 8 years, those 3 government departments were like 5 times bigger than when he started. Didn't shut down any of them. So yeah, the last guy was Coolidge, who did anything good economically, and he was already fighting a losing battle because we started declining with Wilson in 1914. So in terms of economic liberty, you have to go back to what's the famous law case? I thought I'd show my legal credentials, but
I can think of a dozen law cases that economically don't make sense at all.
well, there's the one that basically the last time that basically ruled that the government could not intervene. Lochner, yes, Lochner. I mean, Lochner is the last case where they ruled the right thing and they ruled it for the wrong reasons. And because they ruled it for the wrong reasons, it was ultimately was clearly overturned, and we've been living in an anti-Lochner world since then, where government basically has unlimited power over our economic activities. There's nothing the government cannot do economically. From a legal perspective, the Constitution, the way the Constitution is interpreted, is the inter commerce clause is basically gives the government the ability to regulate everything we do. And that is nuts. That's not what the founders meant. It's not what regulation meant to them. It was to regulate trade, which means to eliminate barriers between states, not to regulate trade in terms of regulation, control it. So it's the whole way in which the Constitution has been interpreted from a, and I wish even the text, so-called textualists and originalists understood even a iota of this. They don't understand the Constitution. So it's the Constitution is being completely perverted in the name of statism, whether for the right or for the left, but it's completely become a statist document. When it was an anti-statist document, it was limiting the powers of government. It was trying to restrain government, and now we've made it government unlimited in its powers. How do you reverse that? And until you reverse that, you don't get on the right track. And you can't reverse that when even Federalist Society trained lawyers become Supreme Court justices screw it up. And your hero, the biggest of them all, Anthony Scalia, didn't believe in individual rights. He thought they were nonsense on stilts. So he couldn't even have a conversation with Thomas Jefferson. They wouldn't have been talking about the same thing. And he's an originalist. So it's so depressing. Sorry. But you're lawyers, you'll do okay.
Give it up for Yaron.